So I recently replaced this musty piece of shiplap
Yeah, boy.
with a custom-built MDF cabinet door, complete with soft clothes, inset hinges, and with a total materials cost of around $50. You see, while the contractors that redid the basement installed this beautiful trim and baseboard, the sewer cleanout access was a bit of an afterthought as they just screwed and caulked in this painted-over shiplap, leaving us with a bit of a non-functional eyesore.
Bruh.
So I wanted to install something functional with a super clean look that would allow me access from time to time, but not necessarily encourage the kids to play in there, as it's still an unfinished area. So after taking some measurements, I went over to Home Depot to pick up some moisture-resistant MDF for around 25 bucks. Now the closest piece that they sell to what I needed was 3/4 inch by 2 by 4 feet, which ended up being the exact thickness, but still a few inches larger in terms of both width and height. Luckily, I was able to get them to cut it down to the exact size I needed for free on their panel saw, similar to the one you see here. Now, height-wise, the cut had to be about an inch shorter than the actual door frame. You see, the carpet sits around 3/4 of an inch from the slab, so we were going to need to hang this around 7/8 off the floor in order to clear the carpet when opening the door. So the plan here is to put in 3 hinges, as the door is going to hinge out this way. And we're going to have to take this piece of framing out because as we're going to be using inset hinges, they will need to be anchored flush to the 2 by 4 right behind the piece of trim. The reason we're going to have it hinge on the right side of the frame as opposed to the other side is that the 2 by 4 that this little piece of wood here is screwed into actually sits super flush with the white framing, whereas on the other side, there's a little bit of a gap. Alright, so with that removed, let's get to turning this piece of MDF into a door. Now, before we bore out the holes for the hinges, I'm going to go ahead and give the whole thing a light sanding, paying special attention to the 2 edges that they cut at the store. You see, as a result of the production process, this MDF will have these little fuzzies on all the cut edges, and you won't be able to sand them off completely until after you prime the surface, but we still need to rough them up with a 220 grit or so in order for the primer to seal everything together. Here's a close-up of about what this should look like when you're all done sanding. One thing that I forgot to mention is you'll want to vacuum or wipe all the dust off there before moving on to the next step. Some people will use a microfiber cloth here, but I've found that one of these Swiffer-type dust-collecting cloths works very well for this. The next step before we can get to priming is to bore out the hinge holes. And given the weight and height of this door, the manufacturer recommends that we use 3 hinges. Using our tape measure and hinge bore template, we're going to place our top and bottom holes 3.5 inches into the door, and then the middle one equidistant from the other 2. I'll be boring in there with this 35mm bit that I'll link in the description. A great investment as nearly all standard hinges will fit this size. Once you're exactly on the center of your mark, you'll want to hold it down just enough to keep it from skating around. But at the same time, don't be pushing hard enough to drill through the board. I think it was this exact moment when I wondered why the heck I didn't wait until after this step to dust off the door. You can see here the 1/2 inch cup depth and also my pencil markings for our pilot holes. I'd recommend drilling these before priming and painting as well, so we can do an even better job of sealing the entire piece of MDF. As for the actual drilling, I'll be using this 3/32 drill bit that I taped off to the exact length of the hardware being sunk into the door. This way I can get these drilled to the same depth as the screw, while also not punching a hole through the front of the thing. As we need these drilled precisely where I penciled them in, I like to first reverse the drill and lightly place the hole to get started, before then putting the drill back clockwise and carefully sinking it in there until the tape almost touches the wood. I've found it's fine to err a bit on the shallow side here, as we're primarily focused on placement and avoiding splitting the wood when we screw in the actual hardware. So with all of our carpentry done for the day, after a quick dusting, we can go ahead and get some primer on this thing. I'll be using this shellac-based bin primer that I had left over from another job, as this stuff is super low VOC, and I'm working in the basement here. Now, in the past, I've also finished these MDF cabinets using a regular Kills primer, and gotten a great result as well, but this bin primer from Zinsser is a far superior product for this type of thing, if you're willing to spend a bit more. I should also mention that my drip brush, roller, and rolling tray all come in a package for $1.25 from the dollar store, so we can toss them all when the job is done. Now, when priming any cabinet door, I'd recommend you start with the hinge side to get a feel for the paint, and also go ahead and hit the hinge holes first. This way you avoid rolling any hole imprints onto the rest of your door. Once you've detailed in around those, you can roll out the rest of the surface and don't sweat it if you've got any drips on the side, as we're going to roll out the 4 sides during this pass as well. You'll want your roller tray right next to your door to avoid any drips onto your drop cloth. On the plus side, this watery consistency tends to level itself on the surface fairly well with next to no roller marks. So you can see the fuzziness of the cut edge here that I mentioned earlier. Don't worry though, once this dries, we will be able to sand those off of there to get that super smooth finish before painting. With the back and sides primed, I'm going to tie off my roller in the bag it came in so that I can use it again in an hour when I come back to prime the front. Ziploc bags work great for this as well.
1 hour later.
Okay, so now that this is dry, before we flip it and prime the front, I'm going to give it a very light sanding with this 220 grit sanding disc. We are pretty much only worried about getting those fuzzies off of the cut edges here, so this is a relatively quick step. And you can see that I didn't really have to take a whole lot off before flipping the door and doing the same thing all over again. Okay, so with the door flipped over, we're going to repeat the same priming process on the front and then wait another hour for this to dry before painting.
A few moments later.
So with the door dry, before we paint anything, you'll want to sand off these fuzzies that I mentioned earlier with your 220 grit. A pretty quick process, but again, just something that you need to do when working with MDF. Also, don't leave any sharp corners on there. The paint will adhere a lot better to those if you round them out a bit. Another quick dusting, and we are ready to paint. I'm using this PPG that I finished most of the basement with, and I'll be cutting it with Floetrol. This stuff is a lead-based additive that helps reduce brush strokes and roller marks, so while not essential, I'd highly recommend it for a job like this. I ended up putting 2 coats of this paint on there, letting it dry about an hour between applications, which resulted in a very uniform finish. This roller and handle are also each $1.25 from the dollar store. I'd highly recommend the roller, but not the handle. I also had to remember to prime and paint this small trim piece that I'll be using for the transition that sits under the door. Same exact process here, and once we cut it down to length, we can go ahead and caulk it into place with some adhesive. And on a side note, you can really see just how horrible this roller handle is here. Next time, I'd definitely spend a few dollars more and get a real one. Okay, so fast forward a day, and with both coats of paint dry, all that's left to do is screw in our hinges and pop this thing into the door frame. I'm using these soft, close inset hinges from Berta that I'll link in the description, and you can see just how quality of an action they have there. Now, 2 of these 3 ended up lining up nearly perfect with my pilot holes, but this third one was actually a little bit off. In the end, though, it ended up not really making any difference. As you can see, the screws still have plenty of bite. I did have to do the thing where you first start the left screw and get it to take, then switch over to the one on the right and get that one going as well, before screwing both of them in completely. If you end up in a similar situation, just be sure and do this with the drill on a pretty weak setting as to not strip out any hardware, and you should be good to go. Now you'll notice I've got my hinge placement marked on the door here, as Berta recommends that you first take the hinges apart and then screw into place the part of the hinge that gets attached to the door frame. You then just snap the door into place and lock the hinges. I have to admit I was a bit skeptical of this installation process, but in the end, it ended up going really smoothly. So that's it for this one. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing or hitting that like button, as it really helps out the channel. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.